Is AI really transforming the economy? In today's video, I'm going to take a look at a new research report released by Anthropic. It's called the Anthropic Economic Index Report, Economic Primitives. And in this report, they're talking about an extension to a series of articles that they've been working on based on their ability to access usage data of Claude.ai and the Claude API endpoints in a privacy-preserving way and apply economic research principles to this data to get new insights on things like task automation and understanding how the use of AI tools in the real world either matches or doesn't match up to the theory. What I find really interesting based on my own experimentation with AI tools and my background in financial services and studying economics is that some of the findings in reports like this are increasingly counterintuitive. So let's dive in. One of the first things that they talk about is tasks. So which tasks does AI speed up and by how much? They found that more complex tasks were sped up the most. And what they did was they estimated the number of years of schooling you'd be required to have to understand the conversation itself. So tasks with prompts requiring a high school education were sped up by a factor of 9, while those requiring a college degree were sped up by a factor of 12. These results imply that AI's productivity gains are currently accruing in tasks that require relatively high human capital, which is consistent with the evidence they've found in previous reports that white-collar users are more likely to use AI at work. And they say that the same trend holds when they adjust for the task's success rates. So Claude successfully completes tasks that require a college degree 66% of the time, compared to 70% for those tasks that require less than a high school education. This reduces but doesn't eliminate the overall effect. Claude's impact on task speed up scales more sharply with complexity than complexity correlates with a decrease in success rate. So what this means is that essentially what you put into the model, you get out of it. If you are using more complex prompts and sharing more context, you are going to get better output. And these higher value tasks that require more human capital, the AI tools are going to give you even more leverage. And this is kind of counterintuitive. And this section of the report alone invalidates a number of economics papers which have come out over the last few years and had predictions about what AI would do for different types of tasks. So they were assuming that the higher skilled tasks would remain and all the lower skilled tasks would just get automated. And that's not exactly what Anthropic are finding here. So what are the time horizons over which Claude can support tasks? So METR, I'll just bring that up. They are an organization which measures how long AI agents can do tasks. And they have a very famous graph which is showing how over the course of all these different models being released, the time horizon of software engineering tasks that a model can do 50% of the time has been going up and up and up. And this is interesting to bring it back to the Anthropic piece, because what they're saying is that on their own data, their own API data, they find that Claude is 50% successful at tasks that take nearly twice as long, 3.5 hours, than what METR's benchmark predicts or finds in 2 hours. And on the Claude.ai website, where someone's going back and forth and nudging and giving feedback, they find that the duration is much longer, even still, around 19 hours. So their methodology is different, but what it means is that the way that these AI tools are being used, if the right tools, the right prompting, the right context, the right human in the loop interventions are happening, their economic impact is much, much greater than a lot of these benchmarks and a lot of other economic research is going to be picking up. And I think this is a really important takeaway, that the jagged edge adoption, so some of the most experienced, highly technical users getting the absolute most out of these AI agents, they are going to be having outsized economic impact in their own businesses, in their own homes, in their own places of education and schooling. What else did they find? Well, interestingly, they found that there's a relationship between how rich a country is and how much it uses AI and all the different benefits that will come from that, which we can kind of predict. There's not much in the way of GDP, PPP pricing where you might make a decision to charge much less to a customer in a developing country versus what you might charge if they were in the United States or Switzerland. That's because a lot of these businesses are US based, the pricing's done in US dollars, the API charging's done in US dollars, and in poorer countries it's obviously much more expensive to do that. And this is something where this research happening by one big AI lab off the back of its own data is really interesting, but it excludes a whole area of usage data which is for other models, the free models, the other labs models. And it would be interesting if something like Open Router would be able to interact with the Anthropic economic research team to come up with a combined way of looking at some of this usage, but I'm not exactly sure how you could do that in a privacy protected way, because I think that a lot of that is already on zero data retention APIs with nowhere near the sort of harnesses that Anthropic is going to have over its own applications and its own API endpoints. So that's probably not technically feasible at the moment, but over time, as more and more usage of these models is being done, we should be taking away from looking at research like this that so much more granular data is available to economists so they can better figure out exactly what some of these consequences of better AI model capability are going to be and help inform policymakers as to what these impacts actually are. So going back to the report, in their first one they found that 36% of jobs saw Claude being used for at least a quarter of the tasks, meaning that Claude could help them with a quarter of the things they had to do every day. Looking across the reports, it's risen to 49%. But when they account for the success rate, which is how often workers do the task and how long it takes, they're coming up with a different picture of which jobs are most affected by the use of AI. So if we look at this chart here, it shows the relationship between task-effective AI coverage and task coverage measured at the occupation level. So effective AI coverage tracks the share of a worker's time-weighted duties that AI could successfully perform. So how many of the things they have to do in their job could Claude help them do? Task coverage is the share of tasks that appear in Claude AI usage. So the dashed line is the line where effective AI coverage share equals task coverage. What this shows is that some occupations are much more heavily affected by AI than task coverage would suggest, and others are relatively less affected. So if they are doing further research in this area, that is going to be super helpful. You might notice on this chart that microbiologists have a much lower point on this chart. This makes sense. An AI tool isn't yet going to do lab work for them. They still need to go and do the lab work, and that's obviously much slower. AI can help them with research, development, and planning tasks, but it's not going to go and do the lab work for them yet. Another question they asked is whether the tasks that AI covers represents the higher skill or lower skill components of a given occupation. Using an estimate that we create of the skill level required for each task, we find that Claude is relatively more likely to cover the tasks that require higher education levels. This aligns with our earlier finding that Claude is used more frequently by white-collar workers. This is one of the things where some traditional economists came up with predictions that this would not be the case, that a lot of the Claude-covered tasks would be in the lower bucket, or that was where the task automation was going to come. But their findings here are super interesting. So they say that they estimated how removing these Claude-covered tasks would shift the task composition of people's jobs. As a first order effect, this would de-skill jobs on average, since it would remove the higher education, higher skill, higher human capital required tasks. Professions like technical writers, travel agents, and teachers would be affected, though a rarer few would see effects going the other way. They say they're not necessarily predicting that this de-skilling will occur, but what they're saying is some of the immediate effects that AI might have are, think about this, if you can use AI to do these higher skilled tasks, then you might be able to change the composition of your workforce so you do not need to hire as many highly skilled, highly paid people. You might be able to get away with less skilled, highly educated people. That's kind of the unsaid thing that's coming through in this report, and it's exceptionally interesting, especially when we know from agentic coding tools and things like that how important high human capital is from getting the most out of these tools. So in their earlier research, they estimated that the widespread adoption of AI could increase US labor productivity growth at about double the trend rate. And they're revisiting that and marking it down a bit because they want to account for the success of the task and the need for human in the loop and intervention. So they're being quite cautious here. But what they say as an example really highlights how massive the impact of AI can be. They're saying even a 1 percentage point increase in annual labour productivity growth would return the US productivity growth to the rates of the late 1990s and early 2000s. This is before models become more powerful. This is before businesses roll out AI agents. This is before the economy really starts to figure out how to deploy this at scale. What it shows is that labor productivity and people being able to get more output for each hour of work is definitely going to be going up with AI tools. And this is one of the drivers of higher living standards. The catch and the thing that a lot of people don't really want to talk about is if you blend that with the de-skilling risk, what levels of AI job loss do you have? Or what levels of job enshittification can actually occur, where you get worse jobs, where you're doing lower skilled tasks because the AI has essentially helped automate all the higher skill things where your human capital used to get leveraged. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but I think it is good that Anthropic at least is really putting in the work to do a lot of this foundational economic research off the back of their actual usage data and sharing it. We obviously need to put an asterisk around it. It is an AI lab using their own data. We don't know exactly how all of their internal processes work, but this is so much better than random economists looking at statistical data completely divorced from the reality of how rapidly AI usage, especially API usage, is accelerating, especially over the last few months. One of the more interesting things about usage that they find is that the use of Claude has remained highly concentrated among computing tasks. They're about a third of all conversations on Claude and about half of the API traffic, which makes sense when you look at things like the explosion of Claude code. Their new report finds that augmentation has overtaken automation, which is quite interesting. They also find that the geographical concentration of AI use remains the same. But what they're saying is some US states are catching up their usage, and this is much faster than previous technology. So their conclusion is that it's highly uneven. So AI use remaining concentrated in different countries and occupations, affecting different occupations in a very different way to others. And what's important to note is a lot of the policy responses that flow from data like this will only be based on the AI model capability at the time the report was done. So this report was done before Claude Opus 4.5 was released. Since then, there's been an explosion in clever and unique uses of tools like Claude Cowork and other things, especially all the different open source coding tools that plug into the Anthropic API endpoints. And what it means is that these task success, task completion, task complexity measures might need yet another form of economic primitive wrapped around it so that economic researchers can look at yet another aspect of this usage, which is the orchestration and coordination of AI agents in a workplace context. So instead of just measuring the task completion, they'll need to come up with some way of measuring, managing an orchestration of AI agents and the success of that orchestration, and benchmarking different ways of using these harnesses to figure out what acceleration on just using it for task automation or augmentation in a single thread, one chat window way looks like. So I think this is where my head is at when I read this report, when I think about my own experience working with these tools and experimenting with them, and mapping that back to what will productivity growth look like, what will operating models look like. I think we need to be really careful that we don't file this away just as, oh, this is interesting. We need to remember that this is on an explosive growth curve. The models are getting better every few months. And if you're running a business or you're leading a function and you are not actively experimenting and folding in using these tools to solve problems for your customers faster, better, and cheaper, you're not going to be in a position in the next few years to remain competitive. Because partly what this report teases out is there are power users, there are ways of working with these tools that have clear productivity impacts. And if this is something that you're interested in, I write a Substack on AI transformation. The link's in the description below. Thank you for listening to me talking about this Anthropic report, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.